What happens when a racist cop targets the wrong man, and the truth unravels in front of a crowd? It was a sunny Saturday afternoon in Portland, Oregon, a day when families filled the local parks, joggers lined the trails, and the aroma of food trucks wafted through the crisp air. At Franklin Park, one of the city's busiest green spaces, the atmosphere was lively but peaceful. Kids played on swings, friends laughed over picnic blankets, and the distant hum of live music added to the charm. In the center of this vibrant scene stood a man named Everett. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, with polished shoes, and a calm yet commanding presence. Everett had been sitting at a cafe near the park, reviewing documents for his job as a civil investigator, before a minor misunderstanding turned into something much bigger. The cafe manager, agitated and defensive, was now arguing with Everett over an accidental double charge on his bill. Onlookers could sense the tension, though Everett's voice remained measured. "I understand mistakes happen," he said, holding up his receipt. "But I've already paid once. I'm just asking for a correction." The manager's response, however, was louder and less composed. "You people always think you can come in here and cause trouble," he barked, his words cutting sharply through the air. Everett froze for a moment, taken aback. The phrase, "you people," hit him like a slap, and he could feel the weight of the stares around him. But before he could respond, the door chimed, and in walked Officer Grayson, dressed casually, but exuding the authority of someone used to control. Grayson had overheard snippets of the argument on his way in, and immediately decided he knew what was happening. Without asking a single question, he stepped in between the two men. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his gaze fixed squarely on Everett. The cafe manager pointed angrily. "This guy's causing a scene over nothing," he said. "I want him out." Everett turned to Grayson, his expression calm but firm. "Officer, there's no scene. I was double charged, and I simply asked for it to be fixed, that's all." But Grayson wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. To him, Everett's sharp suit and composed demeanor didn't matter. He saw a problem that needed to be dealt with, quickly and forcefully. "Step outside," Grayson ordered, his hand twitching near his hip, where his baton rested. Everett's voice dropped, steady and low. "I've done nothing wrong, officer. I'm happy to talk, but there's no need for this." Grayson's response was swift and chilling. "I said step outside." But before Everett could say another word, the situation escalated in ways no one at the cafe could have anticipated. The cafe fell silent as Officer Grayson's voice rang out, his words sharp and unyielding. A few patrons exchanged uneasy glances, while others reached for their phones, sensing something was about to happen. Everett stood his ground, his hands clearly visible, but his composed demeanor seemed only to agitate Grayson further. "Officer, I'm not resisting," Everett said, his voice calm but resolute. "There's no need for this aggression." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snapped, stepping closer, the baton now unhooked from his belt. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the weight of unspoken assumptions and fears. As Everett raised his hand slightly, in a gesture of openness, Grayson took it as defiance. Without warning, the baton came down hard, striking Everett on the shoulder. The crack of impact echoed through the cafe, followed by collective gasps from the crowd. "Stop!" a woman near the counter yelled, her voice trembling. "He didn't do anything?" Everett stumbled but remained upright, clutching his arm. His eyes met Grayson's, and for a moment the room seemed frozen in time. The look on Everett's face wasn't one of anger, it was a quiet, piercing disbelief. "Officer, you're making a mistake," Everett said, his voice still steady despite the pain. "You don't know who I am, or why I'm here." Grayson's face flushed with a mix of adrenaline and frustration. "I don't care who you are," he barked. "You don't get to cause problems and act like a victim." At that moment, a young man near the back of the cafe, phone in hand, began recording. Others followed suit, their screens capturing every detail. The officer's aggression, Everett's restraint, and the murmurs of outrage growing louder with each passing second. "Someone call 911, a patron shouted, irony dripping from the plea. "This is police brutality." Grayson turned briefly, his gaze flickering to the phones pointed in his direction, but his grip on control didn't loosen. Instead, he grabbed Everett by the arm and began dragging him toward the door. Everett didn't resist, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos around him. As they stepped outside, the scene spilled into the park. Families stopped mid-play, joggers slowed to a halt, and a crowd began to gather. Everett's voice, though pained, was clear. "This isn't how justice works," he said, addressing not just Grayson, but everyone watching. "This isn't right." The recording continued, capturing Grayson's growing unease as more voices joined in. "Let him go," someone shouted. Another chimed in, "You're out of line, officer." Grayson's hand wavered on his baton, the weight of the crowd's judgment beginning to sink in. But before he could respond, a voice from the back of the crowd cut through the commotion. "Hey, isn't that the civil rights investigator? I've seen him on the news." A murmur rippled through the onlookers as realization dawned. Everett wasn't just another cafe patron. He was Everett James, a prominent investigator for the state's Human Rights Commission, known for uncovering cases of systemic discrimination across the city. The man Grayson had struck wasn't a troublemaker. He was a watchdog for justice. Grayson's confidence faltered, his grip loosening slightly on Everett's arm. But the damage was done. Cameras were still rolling, and the crowd's outrage was now laser-focused on him. But this was only the beginning. The fallout from this moment would unravel faster and cut deeper than anyone expected. By the time the police cruiser arrived, Officer Grayson's composure had crumbled. The crowd outside the cafe had swelled, their voices louder and angrier. Everett, now seated on a park bench with ice pressed to his shoulder, remained remarkably composed. His quiet dignity contrasted sharply with the chaos around him. The arriving officers, alerted by frantic calls from witnesses, immediately realized something was off. One of them, Sergeant Paula Hensley, approached Everett cautiously. She had seen his face before, on local news segments and in public hearings, and the pieces of the puzzle quickly fell into place. "Mr. James?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. "Are you all right?" Everett nodded, his calm eyes locking onto hers. "I'm fine," he said, "but this needs to be documented." Sergeant Hensley looked over at Grayson, who was now visibly shaken, his hands fidgeting as he tried to explain himself to the other officers. He was being uncooperative, Grayson muttered, avoiding eye contact. But his words carried no weight against the sea of phone recordings and eyewitnesses. Hensley turned back to Everett. "Would you like to press charges?" Everett's response was measured. "I'd like the truth to come out, Sergeant. I'm not here to punish. I'm here to reveal what's broken." What followed was a whirlwind of statements, reports, and phone footage being reviewed at the precinct. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of Grayson's actions. But what truly shocked the department wasn't just the incident. It was Everett's reason for being at the cafe in the first place. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Everett had been working undercover for months, quietly collecting evidence of discriminatory practices in local businesses. The cafe, as it turned out, was one of several establishments he'd flagged for biased treatment of customers based on their race or appearance. His role as a civil investigator wasn't just a job. It was a mission to expose the subtle yet pervasive inequities woven into the fabric of daily life. The department's internal affairs team quickly took over, their focus shifting from the cafe incident to a broader examination of Grayson's record. What they found was troubling. Complaints of excessive force, biased language during stops, and a pattern of targeting minority communities had been quietly filed away over the years. Grayson's behavior that day wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination of a long, unchecked history. News of the incident spread rapidly, with clips from the cafe going viral within hours. Social media exploded with outrage, hashtags calling for justice trending nationwide. Local news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting Everett's poised recounting of the event alongside the damning footage of Grayson's actions. Yet, amidst the growing storm, Everett maintained his focus. He wasn't interested in sensationalism or vengeance. Instead, he used his platform to emphasize the systemic issues at play. "This isn't just about one officer," he said during an interview. "It's about a culture that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. Accountability starts with acknowledging the problem." Back at the precinct, Grayson sat in a dimly lit conference room, his head in his hands. The weight of his actions, and their consequences, was finally sinking in. He'd thought his badge shielded him from scrutiny, but now he was facing a tidal wave of accountability. But even as the evidence mounted and the public demanded justice, Everett wasn't done yet. His next move would challenge Grayson in ways he never expected. The city of Portland was buzzing. News outlets replayed the footage on a loop, and online forums erupted with debates about policing, bias and accountability. Protesters gathered outside the cafe, demanding justice not only for Everett, but for countless others who had experienced similar treatment. Signs reading, "Justice for All" and "End Bias in Policing" lined the streets, and speakers took turns sharing their own stories of discrimination. Everett's face became a symbol of quiet strength. His interviews went viral, not for their outrage, but for their measured, empathetic tone. "Anger won't fix this," he said on a live broadcast. "Change requires understanding and accountability. We have to address the root, not just the symptoms." For Grayson, the fallout was immediate. He was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, and his name became synonymous with everything wrong in modern policing. Neighbors avoided him, friends distanced themselves, and his own family struggled with the shame of his actions. The man who once wielded authority with pride now felt its absence, like a weight pressing on his chest. At the same time, the cafe faced its own reckoning. Patrons boycotted the business, and the manager who had escalated the situation resigned under pressure. Former employees came forward with stories of biased practices, further tarnishing the establishment's reputation. The ripple effect of Everett's calm defiance spread far beyond the initial incident. But amidst the chaos, Everett remained focused. He had no interest in fueling division. Instead, he saw an opportunity for education and growth. He worked closely with community leaders to organize workshops on implicit bias, inviting both civilians and law enforcement to participate. His message was clear. Change starts with individuals willing to confront uncomfortable truths. As protests continued, Everett received an unexpected invitation from the city's police chief. She asked him to speak at a department-wide training session, a move that sparked controversy but also hope. Some officers resisted, viewing Everett as an outsider trying to undermine their authority. Others, however, saw the invitation as a chance to listen and learn. The day of the session, the tension was palpable. Officers filled the room, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Everett stood at the front, his presence commanding yet unassuming. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. Instead, he shared his story, the struggles he'd faced, the discrimination he'd endured, and the hope he still held for a better future. "Bias isn't always intentional," he said, his voice steady. "But when it goes unchecked, it becomes dangerous. We all have a role to play in creating a system that serves everyone fairly." The room was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. Even Grayson, sitting near the back, couldn't deny the truth in what Everett was saying. For the first time he saw Everett not as an adversary, but as a man fighting for a cause greater than himself. But while Everett's words planted seeds of change, the real turning point was yet to come. A confrontation that would force Grayson to confront his own humanity. Grayson sat in the dimly lit room of the Restorative Justice Center, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been weeks since the incident at the cafe. Weeks of public shame, isolation, and sleepless nights. Now, he was here, facing the man he had wronged. Across from him, Everett sat calmly, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. The facilitator, a middle-aged woman with a soothing voice, began the session. "This space is for open dialogue," she said, looking between the two men. "No interruptions, no judgment. Officer Grayson, you may begin. Grayson's throat felt dry. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, struggling to find the words. He paused, then started again. I want to apologize. For what I did. For how I acted. It was wrong. Everett's expression didn't change. He waited, giving Grayson space to continue. I thought I knew what was happening that day, Grayson said, his voice cracking slightly. I thought I was doing my job. But I see now that I wasn't listening. I didn't see you. I only saw what I assumed about you. And I'm ashamed of that. The room was silent for a moment. Then Everett spoke, his tone measured. Do you understand what that moment cost me, Officer Grayson? It wasn't just physical pain. It was the realization that no matter how hard I work, how I dress or how I carry myself, someone like you could still see me as a threat. Grayson looked down, his hands clasped tightly together. I do now, he admitted, and I hate that I was part of the problem. Everett leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. Acknowledging the problem is the first step. But what matters is what you do next. What will you change, Officer Grayson? Not just for yourself, but for the people you serve. Grayson swallowed hard. I don't know yet, but I'm willing to learn. I want to be better. The facilitator nodded, encouraging the dialogue to continue. Everett softened slightly, his voice carrying a tone of quiet resolve. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. And it starts with accountability. Understanding that actions have consequences. I'm not here to punish you, Grayson. I'm here because I believe people can grow. The session continued, delving deeper into the choices that had led to that moment at the cafe and the broader implications of systemic bias. By the end, Grayson was emotionally drained, but also oddly hopeful. For the first time, he felt the weight of his responsibility, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to make amends. But the real test wasn't in this room. It was in how Grayson would carry these lessons into his life moving forward. In the weeks following the restorative justice session, Grayson began to take deliberate steps to address the damage he had caused, not just to Everett, but to the community he was sworn to protect. His first move was attending every workshop on implicit bias offered by the department, even the optional ones. At first, he felt like an outsider, surrounded by people who now saw him as the poster child for misconduct. But he stayed, listened, and took notes, his silence speaking louder than any defensive words could. Meanwhile, Everett continued his mission, using the platform the incident had given him to amplify the voices of those often ignored. He spoke at town halls and schools, sharing his story not to incite anger, but to inspire change. His message was simple. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about restoring balance. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Grayson approached Everett at a community event. This time there was no uniform, no badge, just a man with an outstretched hand and an expression of humility. I know it'll take time, Grayson said, his voice steady but quiet. But I want to help, however I can. Everett studied him for a moment before shaking his hand. Then start by listening, he replied. The rest will follow. Together, they began collaborating on a new initiative, a joint program between the police department and the Human Rights Commission. The goal was to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served, fostering mutual understanding through dialogue and training. It was an uphill battle, met with skepticism from all sides, but Everett and Grayson stayed the course. For Grayson, the work became deeply personal. He began speaking at police academies, sharing his story as a cautionary tale for recruits. Your badge doesn't make you infallible, he would say. It makes you accountable. Over time, the program began to show results. Complaints of misconduct dropped. Community trust improved, and officers started approaching their roles with greater empathy. It wasn't a perfect system. There were still setbacks and challenges, but the change was undeniable. As for Everett, his resolve only grew stronger. He remained a relentless advocate for justice, but he never lost sight of the humanity in his mission. "We all make mistakes," he often said. "What matters is whether we learn from them." But this wasn't just Everett's story or Grayson's. It was a story about what can happen when accountability meets courage, and when individuals choose to see each other not as adversaries, but as people. Months turned into a year, and the city began to feel the ripple effects of Everett and Grayson's efforts. The program they had started didn't just change policies, it changed people. Officers who had once dismissed the idea of bias training began to speak openly about their experiences, acknowledging their blind spots and taking steps to do better. Community members who had lost faith in the system started to see glimpses of hope. Everett's story, and the way he handled the injustice he faced, became a testament to the power of grace under pressure. His ability to channel pain into progress showed that real change often begins with one person refusing to give in to anger or despair. For Grayson, the journey was far from over, but he was no longer the man who walked into that cafe with assumptions and arrogance. He carried the weight of his mistakes not as a burden, but as a reminder to remain vigilant against the biases that once ruled his decisions. And though he could never undo the harm he had caused, he dedicated himself to ensuring it wouldn't happen again. Not on his watch. As the story spread beyond Portland, it became a source of inspiration. It reminded people that accountability isn't about tearing each other down. It's about building something better together. The conversations Everett and Grayson started echoed across communities, sparking dialogues about justice, empathy, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. And so, the story leaves us with a question. What kind of change are we willing to fight for? Are we brave enough to look inward, to confront our own biases, and to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult? If this story resonated with you, share it, talk about it, and think about how you can be part of the solution in your own community. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire action and spark important conversations.